Good afternoon. My name is Abena Asare, and I am Associate Professor of Africana Studies and History at SUNY Stony Brook University. My paper today is entitled, What to Do About the Country, Thinking About Home and Nation with Chinua Achebe and James Baldwin in the year 2020. At the hearing of my voice, we, in our different locations, are grappling with the United States' descent into an abyss of our nation's collective making, albeit not of our collective desire. It is unclear whether liberation or justice is still on the menu in these here United States, or whether we are in a season of retrenchment, a time to watch, wait, hoard local power, and ultimately survive. What to do about the country? To navigate this question, I turn to Chinua Achebe and James Baldwin, two 20th century writers who, throughout their lifetimes, wrestled with the inadequacy, the disappointment of the nation state as a vehicle for securing Black freedom, both on the political and the intimate planes. For both Achebe and Baldwin, their country's inability to deliver freedom to the human beings within the borders was a point of deep disappointment. Both men exposed and mourned their nation's tendency to function as a vehicle for the reproduction of political, social, economic, emotional, and psychological violence against marginalized individuals and groups. Sound familiar? For both, the question of how to wear the cloth of their respective national identities while walking toward freedom was consistent. Each would return again and again to this question throughout his life. Of course, their respective countries were different. There were different hopes, expectations, histories, and resources associated with the United States in the last decades of the 20th century and post-independence Nigeria in that same time period. The ambivalence that each maintained toward his home country and toward the nation state form more generally was different in genesis and function. James Baldwin's aversion to U.S. nationalism was blunt, scathing. He described his country as, quote, a sunlit playpen in which so many citizens lose first their identities and then their minds, unquote. To continue quoting Baldwin, forays, frontiers, and flags, all were utterly useless. Achebe's critique of Nigeria was no less sharp, but he was more circumspect. In today's circumstances, Achebe noted, bearing a Nigerian passport might not sound altogether like an unqualified piece of good news, but I have never thought it was, which is precisely what it means to have my work cut out for me, unquote. Both Baldwin and Achebe lived, wrote, and thought freedom askew and apart from the limits of the nation state. They had to. Their countries had exiled them, made war upon them, slandered them, disabled them, and disillusioned them. In so doing, they're models for us in this time when we each must individually and collectively decide what to do about the country. What do we hold on to when looking to the future? Where is the arena in which we should struggle for justice? How do we walk the line of nationalist imaginary in a country that is sliding toward fascism? The iconic meeting of Baldwin and Achebe in 1980 at the University of Florida, the event that we have come together to commemorate, offers lessons about the estrangement of diaspora, the failures of the nation state, and where freedom's home is when you live and create askew from the nation state. This meeting in Gainesville is a lesson for our time about how to wear the cloth of national identity in difficult moments. But before we get to Gainesville in 1980, we must contend with the nation. James Baldwin's United States, like our own, was a settler state, a country located upon stolen land and built by stolen labor that nonetheless, to Baldwin's chagrin, insisted on its innocence. Quote, "The crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I, nor time, nor history will ever forgive them," Baldwin wrote in The Fire Next Time, "is that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds and thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it." Unquote. From the moment that James Baldwin arrived into the world, a poor, Black, gay, male child in Harlem, the chasm between the country's rhetoric and its reality were made plain in his life and body. Observing this chasm swallow his father and threaten countless others, including himself, Baldwin was fixed as an outsider in the country of his birth. The outsider, as it were, can hardly be a good nationalist. The promise and comforts of nationalism elude him, knowing as he does that they tend to mask the suffering, exploitation, and exclusion of himself and others. When a group gathers round the flag, the outsider is attuned to those beyond the door. Shivering, the person for whom the flag's value is less than the cloth from which it was sewn. Accordingly, Baldwin thought, lived, and dreamed aslant and askew from an American national identity. He famously had to leave his country regularly and often in order to write. Exile was a mode of survival, a way to hold space for and fan the flames of his gift. Just 3 years before his soul flew from his body, James Baldwin reflected on the bitter lesson of his years under the American flag. Quote, "What has happened in the time of my time is the record of my ancestors. No promise was kept with them, no promise was kept with me. Nor can I counsel those coming after me, nor my global kinsmen, to believe a word uttered by my morally bankrupt and desperately dishonest countrymen." Unquote. From cradle to grave, James Baldwin looked with narrow eyes and increasingly despairing voice at the United States. Now, Chinua Achebe's relationship with Nigeria was also complicated. Achebe wrote, lived, and thought in between the village and the world. His work was simultaneously hyper-local and cosmic in scale. For Achebe, Nigeria was a tether and a center. His wish, in his own words, was never to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. His intention was to write Nigeria, to fix Nigeria, to teach Nigeria, but his own life story and his work unfolded in the space beyond the borders of his home country. His 1983 pamphlet, The Trouble with Nigeria, speaks about the failures of the post-independence African nation and the need to staunch the flow before it is too late. Like most other texts written in this vein, Achebe here is in pursuit of a, quote, modern and attractive country, unquote, that has not yet been the fruit of independence, but which he believes could be made real. It is not too late, Chinua Achebe insists, to set the nation on course. 30 years later, things have shifted for Achebe. In There Was a Country, a book written after his car accident, after his partial paralysis, after it was clear that exile was not merely a sojourn, but itself a destination, Achebe's insistence that Nigeria can be redeemed, that, quote, our condition is not totally bereft of hope, unquote, has shifted. The dream animating this book is not the future redemption of Nigeria, but a memory of a ghost country, a place that existed briefly and by and large in the hearts and minds of its people, many of them dead. Biafra. When the prospect of national redemption fades into the mist, or the timeline to true reform seems to extend too long, Achebe flies to the realm of memory, a ghost country that decidedly was not Nigeria and ultimately was stillborn. Throughout his life, Achebe was attuned to the nourishment and the power that come from home and from belonging. My home, Achebe says, was not merely a house or a town, but an awakening story in whose ambiance my own existence had first begun to assemble its fragments into coherence and meaning. Unquote. For Achebe, Nigeria, the nation, had burned him, scarred him, disabled him, exiled him. But finally, he had to reconstruct his vision of home to something simultaneously more expansive and more specific than the country of birth. This type of reconstruction was also part of the process for James Baldwin. When Chinua Achebe and James Baldwin met for the first time in 1980 at the African Literature Association conference in Gainesville, they had already long been meeting in the realm of the mind. Their paths as writers, intellectuals, and visionaries had been crisscrossing, looping, and weaving and circling one another for years. That strange evening in Florida, as Achebe described it, was the culmination of years of longing and communing across great distances of geography, experience, politics, and artistic striving. In 1963, 17 years before they met in Florida, Chinua Achebe had hoped to meet James Baldwin, this man whose books, quote, blew his mind, as part of his first trip to the United States. As part of a UNESCO tour, Achebe had specifically asked to meet this man with the fearlessness of Old Testament prophets and the clarity, eloquence, and intelligence of ancient African griots. Unfortunately, Baldwin was not around. He had traveled. And this was true throughout Baldwin's life. His deep and violent entanglement with the United States meant that he was often not around. Close to the time when Chinua Achebe was looking for James Baldwin in the United States, James Baldwin was moving through Israel, France, Switzerland, and Turkey looking for Africa. That is to say, Baldwin was wrestling with the limits of the nation state and national identity in his own pursuit of freedom. Late in 1961, James Baldwin accepted an assignment from The New Yorker to travel to Africa and the Middle East to explore emergent Francophile West African nations. Now, Baldwin never managed to write this article as such. The letters he sent to his editors and friends in 1961 and 1962 offer some insight into some of the possible reasons why. Quote, "My bones know somehow something of what awaits me in Africa," unquote, Baldwin wrote from Israel in October 1961. "That is one of the reasons I have dawdled so long. I'm afraid." What might James Baldwin have to fear from so-called Africa? It would be nice to be able to dream about Africa, Baldwin wrote, but once I have been there, I will not be able to dream anymore. Upon arrival on African soil, bright illusions about the continent as a site of recognition and succor might and probably would shatter, Baldwin intimated, and he would be required to speak of this dissolution. How could he bear this? And how could he bring this news back to Black folk in the U.S.? Contrary to Chinua Achebe's reflection that Baldwin was not scared of anybody or anything, he was not even scared of Africa, this was what Achebe wrote about Baldwin after Baldwin's death. Baldwin himself, at one point in his life, registered his fright and said so. The complexity of diaspora, the turbulent depths running underneath County Cullen's simple question, what is Africa to me, also troubled the brilliant James Baldwin. By 1980, when they met in Florida, much had occurred in both men's lives since the years when Achebe was looking for Baldwin and James Baldwin was searching for Africa and for home. If they hadn't met before, it was because of these cycles of going and coming, the migrations and turnings made necessary by the brokenness of their respective nation states. Baldwin was a man always on the move, finding a way to write and live and earn and breathe. Achebe was also moving, pulled across oceans and continents by academic grants, teaching jobs, warscapes behind, and opportunity in front. This meeting, the fact that it had not occurred earlier, the fact that it occurred at all, was a function of diaspora. And when they met in the flesh, James Baldwin was greeted exuberantly by Chinua Achebe, who uttered a literary pun. "Mr. Baldwin, I presume." Immediately, the listener would hear the echo of Joseph Conrad's famous line, "Mr. Kurtz, I presume," from the dehumanizing classic Heart of Darkness. The listener would also hear another reference, this time to Chinua Achebe's iconic text eviscerating Conrad's deeply racist rendering of Africa. This text entitled, "An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness." What rich diasporic literary language is this? Upon meeting these layers of history, representation, and struggle that both these men spent their lives sifting through, are conjured up in a single sharp utterance. Later on, in his public remarks, James Baldwin reciprocated in kind when he recognized Achebe as his buddy, a brother he had not seen in 400 years. Now, in Achebe's telling, the attending crowd erupted into gleeful applause at the poignancy of this quip. Very few people heard what he called the terrible aside that followed. It was never intended that we should meet. This, of course, was a reference to the ruptures created by 400 plus years of slavery, empire, and the worlds that these processes wrought. Alongside this claim of transatlantic fraternity, there is a swift current of loneliness, a, quote, keen homelessness, in the words of Baldwin. "What did I ever do to deserve so ghastly a birthplace?" Baldwin cried out while in Israel in 1961. So, of course, there was joy at this meeting, the joy of finding each other again, despite the historical ruptures that erect silos of nationhood around Black lives and Black freedom. Brothers indeed, despite the passports, the currencies, the power and lack thereof associated with different national identities. Suddenly, a voice interrupts the conversation, a male voice intruding over the PA system, the original Zoom bombing. You gonna have to cut it out, Mr. Baldwin. We can't stand for this kind of going on. The shocked audience holds its breath for a moment. Finally, James Baldwin speaks clearly into the mic again. Mr. Baldwin is nevertheless going to finish his statement, and I will tell you now, whoever you are, that if you assassinate me in the next 2 minutes, I'm telling you this. It no longer matters what you think. The doctrine of white supremacy on which the Western world is based has had its hour, has had its day. It's over. What else is this trembling assertion, if not an echo of Chinua Achebe's wistful sigh? There was a country. James Baldwin insists that white supremacy has had its day at the cusp of the Reagan era in 1980. And at that moment, we see the shadow of a ghost country, a place that exists apart from the confines of our present moment. There is a place, there was a country, there is a home apart from and despite the constraints of the nation state. This is the task in this year 2020, reconstructing the meaning of home so that we may be nourished and have the power that comes from place and belonging, despite the failures of our nation state. In this work, we must find our siblings around the world, brothers and sisters and folks we haven't seen in 400 years and whom we were never intended to meet.